Welcome, everyone, to Terror Talk with Shannon and Kathy.
Welcome.
Welcome. Today on the show, we are going to talk about a few things, Menendez. I want to give a brief update on something I read recently after the election that changes a little bit of what's going on for them in real time. And then we're going to talk about the recent Netflix documentary that I believe was 3 episodes. And then we're also going to talk about Monsters, the new 9-episode series from Netflix is on the Menendez. Like you might remember, he did Dahmer. This is Ryan Murphy's series. He did Dahmer. We talked about that. And now he's done a Monsters season on the Lyle and Erik Menendez story. And so we'll talk about that as well. But I wanted to start out by first saying, for those of you who are not up on LA Democratic news or whatever government news, which most of you probably aren't, the incumbent Los Angeles Democratic District Attorney, George Gascon, there's a little accented G over his O there, lost his re-election bid against former federal prosecutor Nathan Hochman, an independent candidate. And so we have a new DA, basically. And so whereas Menendez, the Menendez brothers have a hearing scheduled for a resentencing on December 11th of 2024, where they're hoping to get out of prison. This particular district attorney takes office on December 2nd, 9 days before their hearing. And the news is, and at least all of the sound bites that you hear this guy say basically is that, I'm going to give it all the concern I can, and I'm going to, it's going to take time. So what I'm thinking is going to happen is they're going to have a delay. They're going to try to delay the hearing. I think so too. Because he's going to need to get up to speed, and the Menendez camp is not going to want him to not be up to speed on what's going on, even though maybe they would enjoy that. Although I would imagine if he's not up to speed, it's going to be a no thank you. So they probably want him to get up to speed. And he's promised, Nathan has promised to do his due diligence and all of that. But also, Los Angeles in general has lost a lot of trust in our prosecutors. And so I think the public is probably going to want him to go hard on them. And so we'll just see how he's going to have to try to rebuild our faith in our prosecutors in this town. And so it's tough. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But I wanted to bring that up because if you're listening to this episode right after it releases, that's sort of the vibes.
Yeah, it could definitely put an end to their wishes.
Yeah, some delays for sure.
Yeah.
And then we'll see what ends up actually happening when they do have the hearing. We'll see what happens on this resentencing. But the documentary is called The Menendez Brothers, but it's 2024. Now, there's been a ton of these documentaries out, but it's Netflix, and it's a 2024 one is the one we're talking about. Because we've done episodes before on other ones.
We did mini casts on their whole trial.
Yeah.
This is the most recent. I actually found this to be a really good documentary.
Yeah, I thought it was good too.
And I think that you get interviews not only from the brothers, but then also from, the former district attorney at the time, Pamela Bozanich, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. She had a lot to say.
Yeah, she did.
Very angry about the whole sensationalizing of the piece. They talk about how Lyle sort of became who he is and how trauma works that way. Erik admitted to, and I'm going to give some more specifics here. Erik admits to the lack of investigation and how easy it was for them to get away with things. But then they also focus on this weird thing that Shannon and I were talking about before we started recording today, which is sometimes it's really hard for people to hold the space for the fact that someone could be abused as a child or molested as a child and also be a narcissist or a sociopath. Narcissists and sociopaths, a lot of that is rooted in trauma. And that's not to say we excuse them for their behavior, but it means that it just depends on the outcome of that abuse and the other factors in their world, in their environment, that develop whatever personality comes from that. Not all folks, I just want to be clear, not all folks who are molested become sociopaths. Okay?
Well, that's the different thing. It's not a cause and effect.
It's not.
But it's also not an anomaly.
No, it's not.
It happens.
And I think what we don't want lost on this is that regardless of whether they were abused or not, and I actually believe they were, that they grew up with a sociopathic father and an enabling borderline-ish mother, right? And so they are also the product of that, and they were abused. So they
Sexually and physically.
That's right. Emotionally, all of it. So that complicates things. And I think that's where people, when I hear people talk about this case, they go, do you think they're abused though? Or did you think they made it up? Because they went and spent all this money after. I'm like, both could be true.
Yeah. Why is the spending of the money seem like you could write a narrative for both sides of that argument?
Yeah.
If they were abused, then they're finally free.
Big
and
F you.
they're finally free, or they feel free in, briefly. And also managing the complicated emotions of killing your parents while still loving them, while also being abused by them.
Yeah.
It's complicated, man.
Yes, it is. And so is this their first taste at freedom? And then is it like, well, then
they were kids, man.
They were kids. And so they talk about Erik spending $50,000 on a tennis coach to go pro, and how this, facilitates, like, money became the motive. They bought all these cars, they bought all these things. Well, you kind of have to look at that as almost like a state of mania.
Yeah,
right?
I do. I also see the other narrative there of, like,
yes, of course.
Motive, whatever. But it
doesn't mean they didn't shoot their parents.
No, it doesn't exactly. And at that point, okay, so I realized the defense was trying to make motive the thing. Like, that's what they had to argue for all that time, because, if they were sexually abused, then we shouldn't let them off. Well, I'm not agreeing with that either, right? Like, it's like both things can be true.
That's right. So I'm going to give a little bit of context here, and then that'll make more sense when we talk about monsters and some of this other stuff that Shannon will bring in about Ryan Murphy. So the Beverly Hills DA, who I was talking about earlier, she said that the Beverly Hills Police Department just did not press them. Mm-hmm. And she called it, she said, well, in Beverly Hills, we just have better customer service. And what she's referring to is the privilege of being white and wealthy.
Yep.
Or at least white passing and wealthy. And because we know that they were Cuban and white, right? Mm-hmm. And that if you're wealthy and you live there and you have a position like Jose did in the entertainment industry, the police department just kind of did a half-ass job. And Erik literally says, this is a quote from the documentary, if they would have pressed me, I would have cracked. It was pretty incredible we weren't arrested that night. We should have been. Mm-hmm. So he can even look back and go, like, we had it so easy. Mm-hmm. She also goes on, the DA goes on to talk about Lyle, how one of his responses to all of this is he sort of becomes his father. Yeah. He goes from being somewhat of a goofy outcast to a strange, like, swaggering businessman. Mm-hmm. And this was his way of, and as the oldest or the eldest, preserving the quote unquote family legacy. He buys a restaurant, all these things. And so this is where they start to look at, is money the motive? Did they do this so they could start their own lives? Maybe it's part of it. Again, doesn't mean they weren't abused.
Right. So
a little bit about Jose, the father. He, wealth, prestige, and privilege were wiped after the revolution in Cuba. And so he grew up with privilege, and it was wiped. And when he and Kitty met, he didn't really start to show his true colors till later, but they described it as like her talents and lust for life were silenced because a Cuban father was now in control of the family. And there's this heavy patriarchal place where it's like, your life no longer matters. I am the father. This is my family, and you are an extension of me. Mm-hmm. So she did change drastically. It contributed to the drinking and the pills and all of that because she lost her identity. Jose, when we look at the family dynamic, Lyle was the golden boy. Erik was looked at as weak. And what do narcissistic family systems do? The narcissistic father will divide and conquer. He tried to pin them against each other. It just really didn't work in the end. And, you can love and be afraid of a parent.
Absolutely.
Right? We talk about that a lot. So if you are looking at someone like Erik, who was the oldest, and we saw this in Ted Bundy too, it's better to align with the more powerful parent because that makes you feel safer.
It's just a survival instinct.
It's a survival instinct, which is what Ted Bundy did. He found his identity in his abusive and sadistic, grandfather and father, because they were essentially the same person.
Right.
So a couple more things here. Kitty's brother also has spoken out and denies that sexual abuse occurred and believes that the motivation was inheritance. And one thing I'll say, I don't know this family, but what really gets to me, and I think maybe because I work in this industry, is no one should ever say or state that someone has not been abused. Mm-hmm. He didn't live in that house. Mm-mm. And he didn't know Jose like that. So to make that that just feels like a very defensive statement that is really unwarranted.
Right.
And then we have Dr. Oriel, which is the quack psychiatrist.
Jesus.
Who blackmailed them through recording sessions. And he was willing to convey all information to Jose about Erik. And so one thing that we find out in this documentary was that Jose basically bought this psychiatrist for information. Mm-hmm. And he was hired because he was corrupt already. And the father knew that he would breach confidentiality and tell Jose everything. You know, this guy was like, already had sanctions on his license and maybe more.
Yeah.
And Jose was like, that's the perfect guy. I need a corrupt one who's going to tell me everything.
That's right.
These are just some of the highlights that I think are important pieces and add to the context of this whole case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And bottom line, it's a good documentary. I think I think a good true crime documentary needs to add something to the conversation. It needs to be a little bit new. And this certainly was, I think, adding to what's going on in 2024 with this case, with this family. So I did want to talk a bit about Monsters, the Lyle and Erik Menendez story, which is the 9-episode series, season of Monsters that's now on this case that Ryan Murphy directed. And so it's the story of the Menendez brothers who were convicted in 1996 of murdering their parents, Jose and Mary Louise, or Kitty Menendez. And I mean, I binged this. On the surface, let's go with surface things. Javier Bardem plays the dad.
So good.
Chloe Sevigny plays the mom.
Yeah, they were great.
These young actors, Cooper, I think it's Cook, Nicholas Alexander Chavez, like they knocked it out of the park. No matter what you think about the portrayals, because there's been some drama, and that's one of the things that I'd like to talk about. One, I would recommend the series. I thought it was interesting, and I like Ryan Murphy as a art maker.
And if you get frustrated, I know some people got frustrated.
Yeah.
Just get past episode 3.
Yeah.
And then it really opens up into something. Ryan Murphy does his whole
like
Hollywood
any Ryan Murphy thing.
And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, I'm really watching intergenerational trauma right before me.
Yes. So just get there. Yes, there are some parts that you just have to get past. And some of the portrayals are very over the top. And hopefully, I looked at this interview and I wanted to sort of expound on it with Kathy, because it was an interview with Ryan Murphy, and it was like, in late September, just after the Netflix series had dropped, and there was a lot of like online response and like a little bit of a media frenzy over it, because this case has always done that. So even back in 1989 or whenever this happened, it's like, this was a big deal, and this series just brings it into the forefront as well. So it's co-created by Murphy and Ian Brennan, and I already said who starred in it, 9 episodes, etc. And these are real life brothers, as we've talked about before, and they were convicted in 1996 of the murders of their parents. And so while the prosecution argued that they were seeking to inherit their family fortune, the brothers claimed and remain adamant to this day, as they serve life sentences, and like I said in the beginning, are trying to fix that without the possibility of parole right now, and they've been in, prison for decades now, that their actions came from the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of the hands of their parents. And I think that was their way in the beginning, from what I remember, is to try to get the possibility of parole. It wasn't to like not be sentenced. It wasn't to not go to prison. Mm-hmm. It was to not have to die in jail.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
following the release of this television show, the Menendez family released an official statement, basically, about their response. And I want to just say a few sentences of it so we know what we're talking about. So the family's response: we are virtually the entire extended family of Erik and Lyle Menendez. We are 24 strong, and today we want the world to know we support Erik and Lyle. We individually and collectively pray for their release after being imprisoned for 35 years. We know them, we love them, and want them to come home. Ryan Murphy's Monsters, the Lyle and Erik Menendez story, is a phobic, gross, anachronistic, serial episodic nightmare that is not only riddled with mistruths and outright falsehoods, but ignores the most recent exculpatory revelations. Our family has been victimized by the grotesque shock-a-drama. Murphy claims he spent years researching the case, but in the end relied on debunked Dominic Dunn, the pro-prosecution hack, to justify his slander against us and never spoke to us. The character assassination of Erik and Lyle, who are our nephews and cousins under the guise of, quote, storytelling narrative, is repulsive. We know these men. We grew up with them since they were boys. We love them, and to this very day we are close to them. We also know what went on in their home and the unimaginable turbulent lives they have endured. Several of us were eyewitnesses to many atrocities one should never have to witness. It is sad that Ryan Murphy, Netflix, and all others involved in the series do not have an understanding of the impact of the years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Perhaps, after all, Monsters is all about Ryan Murphy. So that was their statement that they released. So in this article, which is an interview with Ryan Murphy, he really responds to it. So this interviewer asks, and this is an article on Netflix.com, this interviewer asks Ryan like what his thoughts are on the statement. And this is Ryan's response. I think it's a lot of faux outrage. I think that this show is the best thing that has happened to the Menendez brothers in 30 years in prison. They have said as much. They've told lawyers as much. I think it's very difficult to have your lives splashed all over the world. But I think that the show is really doing a good job, a wonderful job of having people talk about their case, talk about their innocence or their guilt, talk about whether they should have another trial or should they be freed. It's informed an entire generation about the case and launched millions of conversations about sexual abuse. The show doesn't shy away from any of these topics. It brings with it a fair share of controversy, but also I don't think the brothers have seen it, from what I understand. And I think that the actors, and then he names the actors, Nicholas and Cooper, do such a wonderful job with a very difficult subject, really layering in points of view and presentation. I don't think the Menendez brothers' relatives understand what the show is about. More than that, I think that male sexual abuse is something that's really not been talked about a lot in our culture, and certainly not then when these trials happen, and certainly not even now. But I think people are talking about that now, and I find that to be gratifying and good.
Yeah, listen, you're going to get some of Hollywood in any show that you watch, but I don't disagree with Ryan Murphy in the sense that I don't know his family. I don't know, or their family, excuse me. So maybe it isn't faux, but I do think that Ryan Murphy, what he did do is he brought some situations, intergenerational trauma, male sexual abuse, right? Even I know that people had a lot of reactions to. I was the way that the audience said that these two boys ended up basically having sex with one another, and how offensive that was. When I watched the series, there were a couple moments where Erik gets really close to Lyle and kisses him. To me, there wasn't anything explicitly sexual.
No, but they implied that there was, because the older brother
had been molesting him,
sexually abused him.
Right.
Yeah.
It was implied, but also there was a lack of boundaries in that relationship.
Of course.
And there was a confusion in that relationship, but I don't think it was exploited to the point where they were fucking on the couch.
No.
And the way that the audience responded to that, and I think this is where people get really uncomfortable around male sexuality when it goes outside of a heteronormative description. And let me be clear, I'm not normalizing sexual abuse and I'm not normalizing incest.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting is what I saw compared to how people described it was a very different episode.
Right.
Was it cringy? Sure. Was it implied? Yes. But was that realistic? Quite possibly.
Yeah.
And that's what people were reacting to. I don't think people know, unless you've worked with incest survivors and sexual abuse victims, things get very confusing for people.
Yes. And for a filmmaker to try to show a whole bunch of different perspectives, because he really says in this interview that, I get that people think it's one-sided or that they think that the series has some agenda to convince you one way or the other. And he's like, I can tell you that we don't. That I attempted and feel I did try to present a lot of different perspectives. And so although perspectives that you might not agree with or like or feel are comfortable are represented too. And so your perspectives are represented and also all these other perspectives, because there is a couple of episodes there where these young men are portrayed like their very worst selves.
Yeah.
They're very unlikable.
Yeah.
So I get it. It's like you see that and you go, oh, well, fuck this.
Right.
It's like, yeah, but we're not going to show. They did kill their parents. So, and they were convicted of that. So
and
we get to say that.
And Ryan Murphy didn't sensationalize them.
No. So anyway, and to your point, actually, one of the other interesting pieces I thought of this interview was, the interviewer asks him, it's the early days of the series, but is there anything that you really felt you wanted to be spotlighted more? In other words, like the media and the public have picked all of these different things to freak out about.
In the documentary or in Ryan's show?
No, in the show.
Oh.
This
I
interview,
just didn't know if you meant the case in general.
No.
Yeah, okay.
So he says it's still early in the series' life, but is there an aspect that isn't really being talked about that you wish was spotlighted more? And to your point earlier, Ryan says, yes, I'm sort of shocked that when people watch the last episode, more people are not writing about how much prejudice was involved in the trial. Because when you watch I was struck by it. When you watch the last, and I was wondering if it was real.
Right.
You watch this last episode, and it's basically the last trial, because there was a couple of them. And the amount of prejudice, the thing that I was amazed at when I wrote it and filmed it is how homophobic those jurors were in both trials, particularly the second trial. How they could not, at that point in time in the mid-90s, wrap their heads around the idea that men or male figures could also be sexually abused.
That's right.
They just didn't believe them.
No, they did not. And that was preserving that toxic masculinity of if you own up to something like that, were you such a little bitch that you couldn't defend yourself? Because if you can get molested, that means our sex is weak.
Right. He's like, the second trial was so biased and they weren't allowed to submit because, they weren't allowed to submit many of their theories about sexual abuse. They were shut down in all their arguments, as is explicated in this episode 8 or 9 or whatever it was. And Ryan says, I don't think nearly enough people are talking about that. And they might think it's biased, but we really did it very, very black and white, cold, hard facts, that episode.
Yeah.
He took a lot from the trial and all of that. And I had to look it up because I'm like, is this real? Because they are so crazy bias. And then they interview the jury people in the documentary you're talking about.
Yep.
And those jury members say, we simply didn't believe.
That's right.
And so they concurred that is what happened. Like, what?
Well, and I think that's why there's a lot of retrospective, they're looking at this and going, really, did they get a free and fair trial?
Yeah.
And all these people they weren't really molested. That's beside the point. They didn't get a fair trial. So we can find that out again.
Yes.
And maybe we get to the same conclusion.
Maybe.
But we know a lot more now. And we're open to actually having the conversation around the fact that boys are molested all the time. And we know that it takes an average of 22 years before a man discloses that he was molested. And a lot of times...
And that's an average.
That's an average. And a lot of times that will happen in places like drug and alcohol rehabilitation centers where they're in inpatient treatment and it comes out in a group and they've turned to drugs and alcohol as a way of coping and repressing those memories. So I think that this whole thing around their sexuality, and because Ryan Murphy is such low-hanging fruit being a gay guy, a queer man, that it was like, oh, he's just trying to throw some faggot bullshit into this and blah, 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 blah. And here then we see this collective homophobia because Ryan Murphy happens to be a queer man who's telling a story about two boys who were molested by their father and had clear symptomology around it. And I just think that it's so telling to how we view male sexuality. And we are so intolerant of going, it's layered and there's a continuum. And just because someone is molested also doesn't imply that they're gay. So I don't know.
There's just so much.
So much.
And the nuances of all of that. And I'm hoping that, the justice system sorts it out and that they can have these conversations and that they can have their hearing. And I realize they've already been having these conversations, but I guess to Ryan's point, that's what he's saying. He's saying, you're not having, this is why we're having the conversation now. And I get that you don't like your boys being portrayed a particular way in some of the episodes or whatever.
Right.
Like I read the statement verbatim, so we know how they feel about it. But also at the end of the day, we're having conversations about this, and can't that serve your family's ultimate agenda, which is to have these boys believed, and they're not boys anymore, obviously, but have these men believed, and they were, by their own actions, by their own murdering of their parents, and then the subsequent trial, their sexual abuse and all of their abuse was outed far more prematurely than they would have wanted to, and maybe never would have talked about it because they didn't want to talk about this. They didn't want to go into that trial and talk about it and give their own defense in that way. They didn't want to get caught. Who would?
For sure. And I also think that if the Menendez brothers were the Menendez sisters, we would be having a very different conversation and the family would be advocating for this. But there's so much shame when we find out that a man in your family that was respected and looked up to and admired and worshiped molested his own sons, because now that implies queerness. And we cannot have a queer patriarch.
Right.
We can't have it.
Or bisexual or just an abuser that didn't care about gender.
Right. I
or
think,
sexual preference.
To be honest with you, I think they'll take an abuser over a queer man simply because of the machismo. And I think that that's really offensive. And it's not just in Latin communities, it's in white communities as well. And I'm not Cuban, I'm Puerto Rican, and I can speak to the fact that, someone would rather you be an addict in your family than gay. So this is a larger conversation that comes down to, we're covering this up again because we are protecting the abuser and the family system. And if we do that, we can put this all away. But if the true story gets out that Jose did this and these boys reacted this way to that, you have completely destroyed our family legacy. And this is why when I go into these family court systems, they say, oh, well, the abuse is unfounded. Of course it is. And unfounded doesn't mean false. It's unfounded because everyone in the family has fucking covered it up. 65% of incest cases remain unfounded. For that reason, we will defend our abusers if we can keep our family name clean.
Without the shame.
Yep.
And I understand this family has been through a lot.
Yes, it has.
And I get why their response is this. And obviously we don't know them, and I'm not going to put words in their mouth. I can only go by their statement, but it's tough all the way around. And I'm really wondering what's going to happen with them and the resentencing, which will be time served, is what they're obviously trying to get. It's been 35 years or whatever.
Yeah. I think everyone deserves a fair trial. And that doesn't mean that I don't know if they're innocent or guilty. That's not the position I'm sitting in. The position I'm sitting in is That's what our justice system is about. So give them that.
Yeah, they just want to be let out. Like they were found guilty and they went to prison and they've been there for 35 years. And they're trying to say like our defense was not respected. We were not, when we were convicted, our defense was not taken into consideration when you sentenced us, basically.
Yep.
So they're just asking for a resentencing. They're not saying they're innocent. They're saying we served our time and we would like to go now because of our motivation that you didn't let us present at trial.
No, that's right.
So
That's right. So I mean, I think and this will be great because what I imagine we'll do is once this trial, if it happens anytime
hearing.
soon, or the hearing, excuse me, we're just going to be able to have more conversations. And whether that's on our mini casts or on our shrink chats, there's a lot now that's going to unfold and more interviews and things like that.
yeah, I'm looking forward to at least talking about it and making it a cultural conversation because that's literally what we have to do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.